some of the rhetoric coming out of Moscow. Some of the stuff actually former president and now chief of the Russian National Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, has said. Some stuff that the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, has said recently is not just that we want to win this war or we want to kill a bunch of Ukrainians, but that there is no such thing as Ukrainianness. There's no such thing as Ukrainians. So if you're waging a war to annihilate the idea of Ukrainians as a separate people, that's genocide.
Welcome to Weekend Office Hours. My name is Suresh Polasani. I'm joined here again by Professor Paul Denary. This time, Paul, it looks like there's a little change of scenery here. Are you in, before getting booked in prison? Where are you at right now?
Yeah, sorry. No, so I'm not getting my mugshot taken. I am basically in Joshua Tree, California, near the site of the Coachella Music Festival. And I'd like to say that I'm here to go see some great music, but actually we're here to watch my grandson while my daughter and son-in-law, whom you know quite well, go to see some great music.
So they get to have all the fun while you get to stay back home, which you're having fun with the grandson.
I came to Coachella and I'm getting to see my grandson, and that's pretty fun too.
Okay, that's cool. Maybe if we have time tomorrow and you get to go, we can record live from Coachella.
Oh, that would be fun. You know, there might be an extra bracelet for me to go tomorrow, which would be fun. There's some great bands playing.
That would be amazing. You should check it out if that's the case. I'm a little bit jealous right now.
Yeah.
We were so lucky. We get to still kind of enjoy this reality right here. This is not the reality that's happening in Ukraine and Russia. And obviously, since the past week even, there have been some major developments that have taken place. You were last week actually in the UK in Cambridge at a major conference as well, so I'm going to be asking you about that. But let's just start off with some of the more significant developments. I'm just going to go through a few, and I would just like your thoughts on those. The biggest thing in the news has been the sinking of the Russian warship, the Moskva. So I just want to understand the significance of that. To me, it looks like it was a World War II era warship, right? Why is this so significant?
Yeah, the warship was built in the 90s. And as warships go, 30 years is not old because the warship itself was built in the 90s. But like most warships, they're constantly updated. So this was actually one of Russia's most modern warships. It was the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is the pride of the Russian Navy, really. In a way, the most prominent ship in the Russian Navy. And it was called the Moskva, which is the Russian word for Moscow. And so it's significant both symbolically because of those factors. It's the flagship. It's called Moskva, and it was sunk, very quickly. But it's also significant militarily in two respects. One is the ship itself had this ability to launch guided missiles all over Ukraine and was being used to do that. So it had been used in a lot of attacks. It was also capable, and people expected that it would be used to at some point support an amphibious landing in the area of Odessa, which is one of the major Ukrainian Black Sea ports that Russia has not yet really taken control of. And so the other thing that's significant militarily is it now basically forces Russia, in order to protect its other ships, to move them much further away from the Ukrainian coast. So up until now, Russian warships had been basically able to cruise up and down that coast with no worries. Now they have a lot of worries. And I think you and I had talked a couple of weeks ago about, some of the things that NATO could do that would help Russia, help Ukraine besides things like a no-fly zone. And one of them was to provide anti-ship missiles. Now, these were not NATO-supplied anti-ship missiles. These were Ukrainian-built anti-ship missiles, which I think, again, is symbolically important. The last thing I'll say is that this warship, Moskva, had been involved in this earlier incident at the very outbreak of the war, when this Moskva had pulled up near this Ukrainian-controlled island called Snake Island, and famously been told by the Ukrainian small Ukrainian force on that island, when asked to surrender, right, they said Russian warship, F off. So it's the same ship.
Oh, wow.
So it's a big deal, both symbolically and militarily.
Yes, and I want to get to the point that you brought up was that you said it was Ukrainian missiles. Russia denied this initially, right? They said it was some ammunition that blew up on the ship. I think U.S. officials just yesterday they confirmed it was Ukrainian missiles that struck this cruiser. So that is confirmed. And Ukraine doesn't even have a navy, right? They don't really have a navy, so they do have to rely on these anti-ship missiles.
It does have a very small navy, but navies are expensive things, and there was a deal made way back in the 1990s to split what had been the Soviet Black Sea Fleet between Russia and Ukraine. And for reasons that we probably don't want to dig into, Russia was given the majority of the ships, and they were given a lease on the base in Sevastopol in Crimea. Now, since then, of course, Russia has seized that base and seized control of Crimea. Ukraine has a small navy. A lot of it was bottled up and basically seized by the Russians because it was based in Crimea in 2014. And most of the rest of it is more like a Coast Guard kind of fleet rather than a blue water navy.
Mm-hmm. So your understanding is at this point, is this a really significant blow to Russia? Like how significant really is this to them and their military capabilities?
Well, I think it's significant. As I said, there's a lot more to the Russian Navy, right? So in that sense, it's not strategically going to alter the ability of Russia to launch certain kinds of attacks. It diminishes it. I think the biggest military effect is that it now limits the things that the other Russian ships can do because they now have to be much more wary. I actually think there's one other really significant impact that we just don't know what it's going to be. But I think it's another must be another blow to the confidence that Putin has in his military commanders. One of the things I asked, just speculating, right, is so who is it that has the job of knocking on the door and going into Putin's office and saying, Mr. President, the pride and joy of your Navy has been sunk by a Ukrainian missile. Or, Mr. President, the pride and joy of your Navy has sunk because we somehow managed to start a fire on it and blow it up. And the Ukrainians are going to say they sunk it, but that's not true. We did it ourselves through our own incompetence. What does that mean for further confidence between the Russian political leadership, which basically means Putin, and the Russian military leadership? What does that mean for relations among the Russian Navy commanders? Right?
What does that mean? What does that mean between Putin and the military leadership? What are the consequences of something like this?
Well, one of the big things that happened last week as well is they changed the military command structure to basically take all the military command for the armed forces, the ground forces in Ukraine, and put them under a single commander who had a lot of experience in Syria. So the goal there is by changing the command structure to get more effective coordination of the attack. And, this is a normal thing in warfare that as things don't work, you change command structures to try to find something that works more effectively. But I think this is just another blow, and we can't see this externally, but there has to be immense recrimination within the Russian armed forces right now. Who is responsible for this debacle? And what's happened now with the Moskva is just another massive debacle that now covers a branch, the Navy, that previously I think had been seen as having been pretty effective in this war for Ukraine.
Is this the most significant military victory? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, is this the most significant military victory, even if it's symbolic more so than anything else that's happened so far in the war for Ukraine?
I think if you want to take a single event, this is the biggest thing. This is a $750 million warship, something like that. This is something that it would take a decade to replace. It's a major piece of hardware. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, this is the single biggest thing by far. In a political sense, it's probably not as important as, preventing Kiev from being encircled. That was probably, but that was not a single event. That was, 3 weeks, 5 weeks worth of fighting.
Okay. And that didn't happen. I mean, like Kiev was not, as far as I know, Russian troops have pulled back from Kiev. Is that correct?
Russian troops have pulled back from Kiev. That's been documented. Many of those forces have been sort of redeployed. You're kind of going back into Belarus from where they were staged, eastward towards Russia, and then they're going to kind of bring them back around and deploy them into places in Russia or in Russian-occupied Ukraine to try to attack westward from the Donbass. That's the current Russian plan, as far as we can tell, and based on their deployments, it's pretty clear that that's what they're getting ready to do. Well, I was going to come back to this question about the Russian command, because one of the interesting things I heard when I was in Cambridge, rubbing elbows with a whole bunch of other people who study this stuff. There's a guy named John Luff who works at an outfit called Chatham House in London. It's basically the British International Institute for, what is it called? Institute for International Studies. Sorry, I've forgotten the official name. But the point is, he's somebody who studied Russia and Ukraine for a long time. He was NATO's representative in Moscow in the 1990s. He's someone who I would say is right more often than he's wrong about Russia and Ukraine. And he said, and this was a week ago before the Moskva was sunk, he was saying that he thinks that Putin is in real trouble with the generals. He says we can't see it, but he believes that beneath the surface, there's real dissent among the military command sort of aimed at Putin. Now, I have to say, his was a minority opinion. Most people who are experts on this part of the world think that Putin's got these people very thoroughly in control. So it was interesting to me to hear John say that. He, I think, to be fair, John said, he can't provide evidence of that, but he thinks this must be what's happening. To the extent that's true, what happened with this ship, the Moskva, can only have exaggerated that. The sense that we don't know what we're doing, that Putin has gotten us in way too deep, and that the command structure is broken.
So if there is a bad relationship between Putin and his generals, does this give more hope to some sort of uprising from the military to actually take out or overthrow Putin?
I think it does, but I would caution people still to be that's still a very small chance, based on what based on my speculation. Mm-hmm. Right? At some point, if it happens, at some point we'll all be saying it was inevitable and predictable. But until it happens, I'm going to keep on saying, yeah, it could happen, but. I think there's enough divisions probably in the Russian military, and there's enough fear that any plot to oust Putin would be found out and would lead to some fairly painful countermeasures, meaning torture and death. So that's my best belief at this point. But I think this points to why I actually think rather than doing the sort of the smart thing, which would be declaring victory and going home, I think Putin is likely to persist to the point where he can declare victory, mm-hmm. which makes this attack in eastern Ukraine now that much more crucial. There's an interesting element of timing there. We're now at April, I think today is April 16th. May 9th is the traditional Soviet Victory Day parade, because that was the day that Germany surrendered in World War II. And I should say, in the West, we celebrate that on May 8th. But for time differences, it's always been celebrated. It was May 9th in Russia at that point. I think everybody assumes that the goal was to have a massive victory parade in Red Square on May 9th. It seems pretty unlikely at this point that even if Russia eventually succeeds in eastern Ukraine, that it's going to happen that quickly. So it's getting politically much trickier for Putin.
I mean, in addition to the sinking of that warship, one of the reasons that this, Russian victory is looking even more unlikely is the arms that are being now supplied by the United States directly, right? And so recently, Russia actually this week sent a formal diplomatic note to the United States warning the U.S. and NATO shipments of the most sensitive weapon systems to Ukraine were adding fuel to the conflict there and could bring unpredictable consequences. And this is directly because President Biden approved a dramatic expansion in the scope of weapons being approved, an $800 million package, including 155 millimeter howitzers. And so it just seems like most things are going not in Putin's direction at this point.
That's right. That's right. And these howitzers in particular, again, according to the military specialists, and I'm not a military specialist, the howitzers are assumed to be the kind of weapon that's going to be extremely important in the different kind of war that we're expecting over the next few weeks when Russia begins this offensive in the east. And we can talk more about how that's going to be different. But to get to this point, Russia is pushing back and trying to raise the sort of level of threat perception in the United States that Russia might escalate in some way. I think the next level of escalation we're likely to see is Russia beginning to bomb the railway lines, the rail trains themselves on which some of these systems are coming in, and probably moving some of those attacks further and further west, towards NATO allies, towards Ukraine's western borders with NATO allies such as Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. Depending on the kinds of weapon systems we're talking about, some of them are very difficult for the Russians to know exactly where they're coming into the country and when. Stuff that could be put in trucks. Larger things like some of these howitzers probably are going to be more visible. And I think the Russians may begin to do something they haven't done yet. We should recognize that. They haven't done everything they could have, which is some really significant attacks, basically right inside the Russian border as these things come into the country, trying to get them before they can lose track of them. So
what happens? I mean, here's the language they use.
Of course.
The language he used was unpredictable consequences. What happens is one of these U.S. supplied howitzers destroys, Russian tanks or artillery. What actually is Russia's response going to be at that point?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is the concern that Putin wants to raise for us is right that American weapons destroy, kill Russian soldiers. And that Putin therefore begins to decide that it's justified to maybe attack some of these convoys while they're still within Poland or Slovakia or Hungary, right? What everybody seems to want to avoid is NATO troops attacking Russian soldiers or Russia attacking NATO territory. That seems to be the thing everybody wants to avoid because that's where things seem to begin to escalate, right, towards a potential nuclear exchange. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if Russia hits something inside NATO territory, NATO then either has a hard choice of either NATO being seen as a paper tiger, or NATO's got to retaliate against Russia. And what happens then, nobody knows. So I think the red line that everybody's still going to try to observe is Ukrainians using American weapons attacking Russian forces, right? But not NATO forces attacking Russian forces. And I think, this is kind of the game of poker that's being played right now. I think as long as that distinction is observed, we'll see Putin get angry and maybe more attacks in Ukraine itself, but not actually. I don't think Putin wants a war with NATO at this point.
So, Paul, you sent me this article from The Guardian. The title was "Putin Thought Ukraine Was a Missile to NATO. It May Be a Boomerang." The major thesis there is that it has solidly turned one of Russia's neighbors, Finland, and also Sweden, into people who are now potentially considering joining NATO, which is obviously not what Putin wants. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, and there's a lot to talk about here. One of the reasons why a lot of us thought that even after this big buildup that Russia would not attack is because we sort of had this sense that it would be counterproductive in terms of Russia's goals. That already NATO and Europe are somewhat fragmented, and this would obviously drive them together. Putin doesn't seem to have realized that, we don't know exactly what he's thinking. But he did attack, and it is having these consequences, which is two states that have historically been neutral, Finland and Sweden, are now both very strongly considering joining NATO, and it looks like they're both going to decide to join NATO, although it's not all done and dusted yet. And from a Russian perspective, in terms of territory and military capability and the length of a border with Russia, they actually are bigger in that respect than Ukraine. Now, not as symbolically important historically for Russia, but Finland has a very long border with Russia, has in the past fought a fairly tenacious war against Russia. Sweden has always been a neutral, but has always been an armed neutral and is a fairly significant military power in its own right, because it's maintained its own indigenous military production capabilities. They build fighter planes, they build armored personnel carriers, and so on in Sweden. And so it would be a major loss for Russia if these two were to join NATO.
Mm-hmm. There's a history of conflict in the past between Finland and
Yes.
Russia as well, right?
Yeah, so in 1940, as it looked like war might break out between Russia, between the Soviet Union and Germany, the Soviet Union attacked Finland as a way of basically creating a larger territorial buffer to protect St. Petersburg, or what was then called Leningrad. And so in 1940, Russia just attacked Finland, and the assumption, as in 2022, the assumption was this would be a quick, easy war. You had the massive, well-armed Red Army against tiny little Finland. This was called the Winter War in 1940, but in fact, the Finns fought tenaciously. And while they eventually, Russia won the war, forced Finland to cede territory and to declare neutrality, what happened in the meantime was Finland demonstrated that the Soviet Red Army was not perhaps all that fearful. So this has a lot of echoes to today. I should say that in the context of 1940, it might have actually been a disaster for the Soviet Union, because the success with which the Finns fought against the Soviet Union almost certainly encouraged Hitler to think, well, let's go ahead and attack the Soviet Union. So this was not just a trivial war. I should also say that one of the tactics that the Finns developed was against the massive Soviet armor invasions, was these brave Finns would get up on top of these Russian tanks and throw these bottles of gasoline and with cloth coming out of them into the Russian tanks, setting them on fire. And this, of course, became known as the Molotov cocktail. So the origin of the term Molotov cocktail, Molotov was the Soviet foreign minister at the time, comes from this Finnish Winter War. And so there were a lot of echoes, really, between that war and what we're seeing today. After World War II, the Soviet Union essentially demanded of Finland, you have to be neutral. And so there's this term Finlandization, which is basically to say you can be free and you can do what you want domestically, but your foreign policy really has to be something that we approve of. We get a veto over your foreign policy. And many people have suggested over the last 10 years in particular that Finlandization would be a reasonable way to determine Ukraine's status. The Ukrainians have rejected this, and the Finns have said repeatedly, wait a second, Finlandization was not a good thing for Finland, right? Everybody talks about this worked for Finland. It did not work for us. We did not like it. It was not something we agreed to. It was something forced. So the bigger picture now is Russia now potentially has a much longer border to defend with NATO, and two significant military powers additionally to contend with as frontline NATO states.
Yeah, it seems like the strategy has essentially backfired for Putin. Western Europe, which has traditionally over the past few decades depended on the United States for security, is now ramping up their own security, and this is nothing that Putin wants, right?
Absolutely, and Sweden can contribute a great deal in terms of military production. And Finland, there's probably, we could debate this, of course, but Finland, because of its proximity and because of the investments it's made over the decades, there's probably no country in Europe that has a more highly developed scholarly apparatus developing understanding of Russia than Finland. I don't think there's any place where there's deeper understanding of Russia than Finland. And so this would be a huge asset for NATO as well, to bring that into the NATO, not the sort of spying apparatus, but the understanding of Russia apparatus.
Fascinating. So everything we've talked about so far, it all seems to be going in the direction where Ukraine's advantage and to Russia's disadvantage, essentially, right? All the events taking place so far. It also seems the destruction that's happening in Ukraine is also being ramped up, though. And one of the scariest scenarios is, as this war drags on, is Putin going to get more and more desperate and resort to more desperate measures, right? Are war crimes taking place at this point?
I don't think there's any doubt of that.
What constitutes a war crime?
Right. So there's sort of three categories of things we want to think about, and the lowest barrier, so to speak, is war crimes. It's strange to say because, of course, war is in many respects the absence of law, but there is this deep and old tradition of the laws of war, and they're represented by the Geneva Conventions, and they say things like, you don't target civilians. You don't execute or torture prisoners of war. And those are some of the big things. You don't use chemical weapons or biological weapons. So anytime a soldier captures a soldier from the other side and then executes them, that's a war crime committed by that soldier. And obviously, a great deal of this has happened on the Russian side. I think there's fair evidence that some of this has happened on the Ukrainian side as well. There's very significant evidence, especially in these places around Kiev. Bucha is the one that we've had the most documentation from, of killing, of deliberately targeting and killing and torturing civilians. Those are all war crimes. You go another step up, though. If war crimes are committed systematically as a matter of policy, right? And I should go back a second. The people guilty for war crimes are the people who perpetrate them. So they're usually low-level soldiers. And maybe sometimes they're direct commanders. If a commander says, go wipe out that village of innocents or go shoot those prisoners. Usually the people at the top say, oh, we weren't responsible for that. That was people who were out of control. But if there's a sense that it's part of a policy, that's where this term crimes against humanity comes in. That leaders are then accused of, governments are accused of, to say that we're using war crimes as a part of policy, right? So that we're killing civilians as a way of intimidating a population or simply as a way of exacting retribution. And given some of the rhetoric coming out of the Russian leadership in Moscow, I think it's pretty clear that that there's at least a case to be made that these constitute crimes against humanity as well. Then there's a step further, which says, are those crimes against humanity intended to actually wipe out a people, a genus of people, a genos? And that's, of course, where the term genocide comes from. And here there's going to be more debate, right? But at least some of the rhetoric coming out of Moscow, some of the stuff actually former president and now chief of the Russian National Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, has said, some stuff that the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, has said recently, is not just that we want to win this war or we want to kill a bunch of Ukrainians, but that there is no such thing as Ukrainianness. There's no such thing as Ukrainians. So if you're waging a war to annihilate the idea of Ukrainians as a separate people, that's genocide. And again, I think there will be debate about that, but the case can be made.
Is it being done at a systematic level, though, or is it just incidents that are happening?
Well, so there's a mixture, right? Which is, on the one hand, there are incidents. So right, the Russians have not yet, as far as we can tell, said our goal is to kill every single Ukrainian. Right? It's not that kind of genocide like the Holocaust. The Germans were trying to find every Jew in Europe and kill them. So it hasn't reached that level yet. What it has reached the level of is saying, we're not going to kill the people, but we're going to essentially compel them to deny that they're Ukrainian. So you're not killing all the Ukrainians, but you're killing the idea of Ukrainian. And that, depending on, there's different definitions of genocide, and that clearly meets some of the definitions of genocide. There's a narrower definition of genocide that says it's not genocide unless you actually try to kill every single one of those people. Mm-hmm. And so far, we clearly haven't reached that yet.
Does this make Putin a war criminal?
Yes. Putin is a war criminal, I think, almost from the very get-go, in that this was a war of aggression. There was nothing about, in terms of any of the reasons in international law that justify going to war, this meets none of them. Right? Really, in international law, the only reason you're allowed to go to war is self-defense.
Who gets to adjudicate that? Who gets to say Putin is a war criminal and we're going to prosecute him? And who actually does that?
Well, the one answer is nobody. Another answer might be the UN Security Council, where Russia has a veto. A third answer would be the International Criminal Court in The Hague. But it's worth pointing out that neither Russia nor the United States is a member, has basically submitted to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal. In the past, go back to World War II, right? At the end of World War II, the Allies formed the Nuremberg courts, for example, or the Tokyo courts, and held our own trials. If you win a war and you can apprehend the people who perpetrated it, you can then decide how to put them on trial. Mm-hmm. There is some possibility. I think what's possible to happen, not likely, but possible, is that somebody in The Hague, the International Criminal Court, or the International Court of Justice, will go through a process. There is some precedent for indicting people in absentia, right? And saying, well, even though we can't put our hands on you, the evidence has been presented and has been justified to indict you for war crimes. It's only of symbolic importance, right? To some people, it's incredibly important symbolically, but I don't think anybody believes that somebody is going to go put their hands on Putin and put him in handcuffs and take him off to The Hague. It has happened to other people, but it tends not to happen to the leaders of very powerful countries. I can say in this context, there is a case to be made that the United States war in Iraq was illegal, and that the leaders of the United States were liable, at least, to be charged with war crimes and put on trial. One of the reasons why the United States rejected the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court from the very beginning was a recognition of that. The United States feared that it would be used for what it saw as political purposes, that someone might decide that George Bush, or going back to some earlier incidents in history, Henry Kissinger, might be indicted. And basically, so the United States said, no, we're not going for this.
Yeah, and the distinction here is, I think any nation is capable of war crimes at an individual level. The major distinction we want to make is when it's actually coming from as a form of policy from the heads of state, right?
Okay.
And that's likely what could be happening right now.
Crimes. Yeah, I don't think there's no doubt that there are individual soldiers, probably on both sides, guilty of war crimes. Mm-hmm. How far up the ladder, all the way up potentially to the president of Russia, do we say those war crimes go, is one of those things that always gets debated. Mm-hmm. And to be perfectly honest, some people, of course, are incredibly cynical about the whole idea of international law and the law of war. Unless Russia were defeated to the extent that Germany and Japan were defeated in World War II, you're never going to have a trial of these people.
Mm-hmm. He would essentially have to be deposed at this point.
Then you're going to have a trial of George Bush for the Iraq War.
That makes sense. Paul, you were at a conference recently, like I said earlier, in Cambridge. Yep. You were amongst a bunch of other scholars as well. Can you tell us a few things, what you learned conversing?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me, I think I already mentioned this idea, this debate over is Putin in trouble or isn't he? I think the other thing that was the other big interesting debate was two questions related to the Russian people. One question is, do they support the war or don't they? And this then boiled down into a question of, to what extent do we believe public opinion polling in Russia? And I can dig into that if you'd like. There's some interesting questions there. But then related to that was then this question of the moral culpability of Russia, of the Russian people, and of Russian scholars. So some people basically wanted to say, this is, very clearly, this is not just a war of Putin on Ukraine. This is the entire Russian people attacking Ukraine. And so some people making this much more, I would say, further-reaching notion, right? That this is the entire Russian people, which in terms of the prospects for the future does not lead to much optimism. But also, begins to get into some basically saying that the entire Russian people are violent and hostile and dangerous, to the point where I personally felt like painting an entire population with a brush that broad begins to make me nervous. But the anger that's being manifested now at the fact that the Russian people have not done something to stop this clearly makes a lot of people say that they're implicated. Whereas this other school of thought that says, wait a second, the average Russian, if they speak out against this, they're going to get arrested and go to jail. And do you really expect people to speak out in that circumstance? And I would just say there's a division of opinion about, again, sorely morally what the Russian people are compelled to do. Mm-hmm. Some people are going to say, look, people in Ukraine are dying and getting raped and tortured. So yes, the average Russian has an obligation to take up that risk and do what they can to stop this war. A lot of other people would say, well, that might be holding people to a standard that most of us wouldn't pass.
Right? You know what? This reminds me.
Those of us in the safety of the United States.
No, I was just going to say,
it's easy for us to say.
It's easy for us to say. It reminds me of when I was in school and you read about, Hitler and when he was in power and stuff like that. And you're like, how does a society let that happen? But when you actually go back and read history, it was like a death by 1,000 cuts over the course of like a decade, 2 decades almost, for him to get to that point, right?
That's
and then unleash the aggression that he did.
That's right.
And this is what the Russian people have been going through, right? For 2 decades.
That's right. So, I mean, I guess I would say, I think on the one hand, there's a lot that the Russian people are culpable for. I think many of them, implicitly made the choice, we'll back authoritarianism because the economy is improving. We'll back authoritarianism because it's increasing our national pride. But this death by 1,000 cuts in Russia or in Nazi Germany, where, I would give a slightly different analogy, which is the famous sort of, frog in a frying pan. Yeah. And the water is getting hotter and hotter and hotter. It's not that, but to be fair, it's not that we don't notice. It's that, and this is, it's that each one of these steps is small enough that we say, well, I'm not going to do something about it now. I'll wait till things get worse. Right. And before you know it. So this, to turn back to one of your favorite subjects and the one that I always try to steer us away from, now I'm going to steer us towards it, which, this is the thing we have to think in terms of the what's happening with democracy in some Western countries. France, with Marine Le Pen, looking like she could possibly win the next presidential election. You look at what's happened in Hungary, which is really not a democratic country anymore. And of course, you look at what's potentially happening in the United States, in the next round of elections. If you say, if 50 years from now somebody's writing the book, where was it? What was the moment in which American democracy died? Somebody might say, well, it was death by 1,000 cuts. It was a frying pan that just kept on getting hotter, and then maybe it got a little bit cooler, and then got hotter again. So these are the things we have to think about in the context of our own country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when there's comparisons made to like, yeah, no, I was just going to say when there's comparisons made, like, people compare like Trump to Hitler and stuff like that. It's obvious, Trump is nowhere close to anything like that. But I think what they see in that is like the demagogue and these small steps that are taken towards destabilization, polarization, and stuff like that, that can eventually lead to something in the future, right?
You say it doesn't matter if he brags about committing sexual assault because we like him for these other reasons. Or we'll just write that off. It doesn't matter that he gave at least vocal support if he didn't actually organize an attempt to overthrow a democratic election because we don't like the Democrats very much and because, well, maybe he did and maybe he didn't. You see where I'm going. It doesn't matter that he, tried to collaborate with, tried to force a foreign leader to implicate one of his domestic political adversaries. That's right. That's right. Those are all instances in which the water got a little bit warmer.
Well said. And then I just want to get to the point. What is your sense with the Russian people right now? I mean, I know it's so hard to understand what's actually going internally in that country, but there has to be a sense of disillusionment with the progress of this war so far. And just to bring it back, I mean, they've been calling this a special military operation from the beginning, right? This has been all propaganda. What is their actual understanding in Russia?
So we don't know because we have very little opportunity to speak privately with Russians right now. But, there are Russians in the West who get to speak their minds. And what I would say is there's a broad spectrum of opinion. Even Russians in the West can now not freely speak their opinion. Because if they're in an American university, for example, and their opinion is they support this war and they think Putin is great, they're going to be ostracized, right? So it's, as I say, it's very, very difficult to get a clear sense of what people think because depending on where you are, you're going to be punished no matter what you say. All that being said, I think it's safe to believe that there's a spectrum of opinion. I think there are people who are gung-ho, believe everything Putin says, really don't like the Ukrainians. And I believe that because those people have been there all along, right? And I wrote about it in my research years ago. Those people have been there all along, so we shouldn't be surprised that they're there now. I think there are probably people who are sort of in the middle who are like, they're patriots, and so they're going to support their leadership, and they're going to support their boys off at war, but they're really leery about this war. And again, that was like a huge chunk of American opinion during Iraq. We weren't really so sure about this war, right? But we're going to support our troops. Then I think there's probably some people who are more at the dissident end of things who are privately going to say, this is a disaster. We've got to stop. And then and actually I wouldn't even call those people the dissidents. Those are people who are maybe they're Russian patriots, but they see this as being terrible for Russia. And then there's probably a narrower group of the dissidents who are like, this is terrible, Putin's got to go. And they're the people who opposed Putin all along. And that was a fairly small state.
And some of those people are dead or in prison, like Navalny, for instance.
Absolutely. Or have left the country. What I think is the key thing to think about, Suresh, is what is the effect of the war on Russian public opinion? And I think it's safe to assume that in the short term, the war will make Russian public opinion more belligerent, because that almost always happens everywhere. It's the rally around the flag effect, right? It's that 85% of Americans supported the invasion of Iraq when it first happened, right? Even people who would consider themselves pretty liberal Democrats, right, signed up for that one. What's interesting is what happens over time when things start going badly. When things start going badly, is when things will begin to divide, right? Some people are going to wait to say, wait a second, this is not what we signed up for. This is a disaster. Time to move to plan B, time to declare victory and come home. And there are other people who are going to say, right, and I think this is probably what's predominant in Russia right now is, this is the Americans' fault. This is NATO's fault. This is the Ukrainians' fault. And our response should be to double down on the determination to win the war and to double down on the violence. And I think that's what we're going to see. We already saw this in the response to sinking the Moskva, which is a bunch of rockets hitting Kiev after Kiev had been left alone for the last week or two. This is what we're going to see: is more violence. I think probably more war crimes, more attacks on civilians. They shelled a shopping mall in Kharkiv earlier today. Everything will depend on what happens on the battlefield. And I will say it again, what will happen on the battlefield is just about the hardest thing to predict. I think in this next phase of war, Russia's going to have the advantage and obviously in just the amount of weapons it has to bring to bear and troops. And maybe this kind of warfare is going to be more suited to what Russia wanted to do in the first place. But I think it's going to continue to be the case that Ukraine will have a huge advantage in morale. How that plays out, we will have to wait and see.
The threat of nuclear conflict, do you feel it's gone up or down over the past month?
Yeah, I think it's about the same. Which is, I think about it like this, which is the threat of nuclear conflict is still very low. Ukraine successfully repelling Russian attacks does not increase the threat of nuclear conflict. The only thing that will, I think, meaningfully increase the risk of nuclear conflict is if Ukraine actually were to begin to drive Russian forces back and out of Ukraine. That would be what might get Putin desperate enough to say, okay, the way to stop this is with nuclear weapons. And these would be then tactical nuclear weapons used on the battlefield in Ukraine. I still think we're an immense ways off from a nuclear exchange between the U.S. and Russia, or between NATO and Russia.
Any predictions of where we're headed? You said everything depends on the battlefield. You said, right? So I mean, I guess it is kind of hard to predict, but based on your conference,
it is. I think the most. So here's a couple of scenarios. One scenario is that the Russians manage either to sort of break through the Ukrainian lines in the east and encircle a large part of the Ukrainian army, in which case they then might really have a clear path towards moving west and seizing large amounts of Ukrainian territory, maybe including eventually then kind of coming at Ukraine from the east and south rather than from the north and west. That's sort of the worst case scenario for the Ukrainians. I think on the other hand, you could imagine a situation in which the Ukrainians blunt this Russian offensive and then counterattack and encircle a large number of Russian troops. And that's the point at which Russia could really escalate dramatically. I think what's most likely to happen is Russia will make some breakthroughs. Russia will have some failures. The armies will become, over time, bogged down. There will be some early initial successes and failures in this next phase. And I expect it eventually to bog down because I'm not sure either side will be able to accrue enough of an advantage in men and hardware and tactics to rout the other side. And there's historical analogies are dangerous. I always think about World War I. World War I had to really last about 3.5 or 4 years before exhaustion, we don't want to do this anymore, became a real important political factor. And so in that sense, I think while it seems like we're moving into the middle phase of this war, we're still potentially very early in this conflict.
I mean, as you said last time, it was the end of the beginning is what our last podcast
end
was
of the beginning.
So it seems to be very much that way.
I think we're roughly, to the analogy, for those people who know World War I, there was this sort of race to the sea in the summer, fall of 1914. And then it was clear nobody was going to achieve a decisive advantage. And then the next phase was, can you punch through the other's line? And that became this trench warfare. Well, we're not quite there yet in this phase. We're through the first phase, and now there's going to be the phase of, can you sort of achieve a decisive attack through tank warfare over the open terrain of the Ukrainian East, which is flat, big industrial cities surrounded by miles and miles of farmland. I would not be optimistic if I were the Russians. I wouldn't be super optimistic if I were the Ukrainians. It's going to be, what do you want to call it? It's going to be tenacious. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a bloodbath. And we'll see.
Well, stay tuned. We obviously are going to be talking about this on a weekly basis, but the end goal is also really just to tie this into broader topics. I think you brought some great insight as always, including finding out the origin of Molotov cocktails, by the way, which I wasn't aware of. So that was very fascinating to find out. But as always, Paul, thank you so much for joining me, and we will continue this discussion next time.